So with the dropping of the atomic bombs, we entered into the atomic age, and the hostilities between uh, communists and capitalists really come to the forefront. Now that the war is over, how are we going to get along? So let's talk about politics. Okay, we didn't really talk about the atrocities of war. Everyone commits atrocities. If you are fighting in a war, you are going to do something you will probably regret later on, and if you don't regret it, then the love of God may not be in you. So, okay, but the Nazis, the Holocaust is probably the most well known and the most talked about. The final solution was the decision by the Nazis to kill as many Jews and as many people considered inferior as possible, but specifically the Jews. So we see rampant anti-Semitism as well as industrialization combining, leading to the death of 6 million Jews. We do see some survivors continuing to suffer anti-Semitism once the war is over. These feelings don't go away. In fact, in many places, the Jews are blamed once again for this war. So Jewish people are still facing a great deal of hardship at the end of World War II, and there's no more concentration camps for them to go to. We see a number of Jewish people fleeing to Palestine, to what will become the new state of Israel. Europe, once again, like after World War I, they are covered in rubble. You can see in this picture we've got two buildings standing in this photograph, and there's a makeshift bridge that the ambulance is trying to cross. But this is the European landscape after World War II. So tons of rubble in the way, cities flatlined, and we see airlifts of food being a necessity because people are starving. So the Allied forces are doing what they can to get food to people. There are refugees who escaped violence. They escaped to the U.S. or to other Allied nations. And for example, whenever they go back home, they continue to face problems. So for example, Soviet refugees, when they get home, they are executed almost immediately because of Western contamination. They've lived in the U.S. or they've lived in a Western democratic nation or a capitalist nation. It's very different from communist ideology. And so instead of, I don't know, trying to retrain them or even listen to some ideas that they had, they execute them in order to keep those ideas from reaching other ears. With the Truman Doctrine, President Harry Truman established that the U.S. would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. The Truman Doctrine effectively reoriented U.S. foreign policy away from its usual stance of withdrawal from regional conflicts, not directly involving the United States, to one of possible intervention in faraway conflicts. So we go from saying, hey, you know what? You have a problem, you're going to deal with it, we're staying out of it, it's not our fight, to we're going to go and make sure that, we don't have any more dictators coming up. The U.S. is going to keep that from happening. The Truman Doctrine arose from a speech delivered by President Truman before Congress on March 12, 1947. The immediate cause for the speech was a recent announcement by the British government that it would no longer provide military and economic assistance to the Greek government in its civil war against the Greek Communist Party. Truman asked Congress to support the Greek government against the communists. He also asked Congress to provide assistance for Turkey, since that nation, too, had previously been dependent on British aid. So you can see there's a perceived threat of communism. And Truman is answering that by saying, I want to send not just money, I want to send people or munitions or arms. I want to do something to help prevent communism from spreading. At the time, the U.S. government believed that the Soviet Union supported the Greek communist war effort, and they worried that if the communists prevailed in the Greek Civil War, the Soviets would ultimately influence Greek policy. In fact, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had deliberately refrained from providing any support to the Greek communists. However, a number of other foreign policy problems also influenced President Truman's decision. In 1946, there were 4 setbacks in particular, which had served to effectively tank any chance of achieving a durable post-war rapprochement with the Soviet Union. The Soviets' failure to withdraw their troops from northern Iran in early 1946, Soviet attempts to pressure the Iranian government into granting them oil concessions, Soviet efforts to force the Turkish government into granting them base and transit rights through the Turkish Straits, and lastly, the Soviet government's rejection of the Baruch Plan for international control over nuclear energy and weapons. In light of this deteriorating relationship with the Soviet Union and the appearance of Soviets meddling in Greek and Turkish affairs, the withdrawal of British assistance to Greece provided the necessary jumping-off point, or the necessary spark for the Truman administration to reorient American foreign policy. In the immediate post-World War II period, Europe remained once again ravaged by war and thus susceptible to exploitation. Secretary of State George C. Marshall issued a call for a comprehensive program to rebuild Europe. Fanned by the fear of communist expansion as well as rapid deterioration of European economies in late 1946-1947, Congress passed the Economic Cooperation Act in 1948 and approved funding that would eventually rise to over $12 billion for the rebuilding of Western Europe. This is known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan generated a resurgence of European industrialization and brought extensive investment to the region. It was also a stimulant to the U.S. economy by establishing markets for American goods. Soviet concern over potential U.S. economic domination of its Eastern European satellites, as well as Stalin's unwillingness to open up to Westerners, doomed the idea of the U.S. helping anyone else in Europe. It's unlikely that the U.S. Congress would have been willing to fund the plan as generously as it did if aid also went to Soviet bloc communist nations, but still, maybe what would have happened. So the Marshall Plan was applied solely to Western Europe. Secretary of State Marshall became the only general ever to receive a Nobel Prize for Peace. The Marshall Plan also institutionalized and legitimized the concept of U.S. foreign aid programs, which had become an integral part of U.S. foreign policy. Oops, sorry, dropping my iPad here. Following the German military leader's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the country was devastated economically, physically, just worn. The German state had ceased to exist. Sovereign authority passed to the Allied powers. The physical devastation from Allied bombing campaigns and from ground battles was enormous. An estimated 1/4 of the country's housing was destroyed or damaged beyond use. Germany's economic infrastructure had largely collapsed. Rampant inflation was undermining the value of the currency, and there was an acute shortage of food, leading to a high level of malnutrition. These difficulties were compounded by the presence of millions of homeless German refugees from the former eastern provinces. The end of the war came to be remembered as 0 hour, a low point from which virtually everything had to be rebuilt, brand new from the ground up. For purposes of occupation, the Americans, British, French, and Soviets divided Germany into 4 zones. The American, British, and French zones together made up the western 2/3 of Germany, while the Soviet zone comprised the eastern third. Berlin, the former capital, was surrounded by the Soviet zone, but it was placed under joint 4-power authority and was partitioned into 4 sectors for administrative purposes. These arrangements did not incorporate all of pre-war Germany. The Soviets severed the German territories east of the Oder and Neisse rivers and placed these under direct administrative authority of the Soviet Union and Poland, with the larger share going to the Poles as compensation for territory they lost to the Soviet Union. As a result of irreconcilable differences among the Allied powers, however, no peace conference was ever held. The issue of German reparations proved particularly divisive. The Soviet Union, whose population and territory had suffered terribly at the hands of the Germans, demanded large-scale material compensation. Does this sound familiar? It sounds a lot like at the end of World War I, the French wanted a hard peace, the U.S. asking for a just peace. Now you've got the Soviets asking for a hard peace, right? The Western Allies initially agreed to extract reparations, but soon they came to resent the Soviets' seizing of entire German factories as well as current production. Under the terms of inter-allied agreements, the Soviet zone of occupation, which encompassed much of German agriculture, was less densely populated than those of other allies. They were to supply foodstuffs to the rest of Germany in return for a share of reparations from the Western occupied zones. But when the Soviets did not deliver the food promised, the Western Allies found themselves forced to feed the German population in their zones at the expense of their own taxpayers. Americans and British, therefore, came to favor a revival of German industry to enable the Germans to feed themselves. Of course, the Soviets opposed this. When the Western powers refused in 1946 to permit the Soviets to claim further reparations from their zones, cooperation among wartime allies drastically deteriorated. As day-by-day cooperation became more difficult, the management of the occupation zones gradually moved in different directions. Even before a formal break between East and West, opposing social, political, and economic systems had begun to emerge. All right. Let's see here. I have to use my notes on this one because I've been using on most of them, but still. It keeps me on track. Let's see. Oh, I can't find it. Let's just talk. Okay, so in the years to come, we see once again the Red Scare in the U.S. causing frustration, causing fear, and causing the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR to not be good. So Western nations and very, very few Eastern European nations created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance. In response, the USSR created their own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. So the Cold War is starting to heat up just a little bit here. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense 13-day, not week or month or anything like that, 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba, which is just 90 miles from U.S. shores. In a television address on October 22, 1962, President Kennedy notified Americans about the presence of the missiles and explained his decision to enact a naval blockade around Cuba, making it clear the U.S. was prepared to use military force if necessary to neutralize this perceived threat to national security. Following this news, many people feared that the world was about to enter nuclear war. But disaster was avoided when the U.S. agreed to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to his offer to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba, which was had become communist. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, which was a frustration for Soviets. The CIA, fairly new during this time, reported these silos as having Soviet missiles. We see a lot of spy action taking place. The reason why there's so many spy movies that take that are placed during, the 60s or the 50s is because this is whenever spy work sort of gets heated up quite a bit. And so a lot of our spy action is sort of like based on this time period. I just thought that was kind of fun to point out. All right, so now let's talk about decolonization. Well, and I tell you what, let's end this lecture here. We will pick up with decolonization next time and probably finish this lecture series.